Hello, it's Miss Teri from the Carnegie Library, and welcome to Fairytale Faire, where I read stories from long ago. So today's story is called The Adventures of Poor Mrs. Quack, and it is a story that has Peter Rabbit in it. And if you don't know who Peter Rabbit is, he was a rabbit character that Beatrix Potter came up with a long time ago, like I think probably in the 1920s. So this story has him in it, and it also has Mrs. Quack, a duck. So without further ado, I'll read about Peter Rabbit and Mrs. Quack. Peter Rabbit becomes acquainted with Mrs. Quack. Make a new acquaintance every time you can. You'll find it interesting and a very helpful plan. It means more knowledge. You cannot meet anyone without learning something from him if you keep your ears open and your eyes open. Everyone is at least a little different from everyone else, and the more people you know, the more you may learn. Peter Rabbit knows this, and that is one reason he always is so eager to find out about other people. He had left Jimmy Skunk and Bobby Coon in the Green Forest and had headed for the Smiling Pool to see if Grandfather Frog was awake yet. He had no idea of meeting a stranger there, and so you can imagine just how surprised he was when he got in sight of the Smiling Pool to see someone whom he had never seen before swimming about there. He knew right away who it was. He knew that it was Mrs. Quack the duck, because he had often heard about her. And then too, it was very clear from her looks that she was a cousin of the ducks he had seen in Farmer Brown's dooryard. The difference was that while they were big and white, Mrs. Quack was smaller, brown, and very trim. Peter was so surprised to see her in the Smiling Pool that he almost forgot to be polite. I am afraid he stared in a very impolite way as he hurried to the edge of the bank. "I suppose," said Peter, "that you are Mrs. Quack, but I never expected to see you unless I should go over to the Big River, and that is a place I never have visited and hardly expect to, because it is too far from the dear old briar patch. You are Mrs. Quack, aren't you?" "Yes," replied Mrs. Quack, "and you must be Peter Rabbit. I've heard of you very often." All the time, Mrs. Quack was swimming back and forth and in little circles in the most uneasy way. "I hope you've heard nothing but good of me," replied Peter. Mrs. Quack stopped her uneasy swimming for a minute and almost smiled as she looked at Peter. "The worst I have heard is that you are very curious about other people's affairs," said she. Peter looked a wee bit foolish, and then he laughed right out. "Ha ha, I guess that is true enough," said he. "I like to learn all I can, and how can I learn without being curious? I'm curious right now. I'm wondering what brings you to the Smiling Pool when you never have been here before. It is the last place in the world I ever expected to find you." "That's why I'm here," replied Mrs. Quack. "I hope others feel the same way. I came here because I just had to find some place where people wouldn't expect to find me, and so wouldn't come looking for me. Little Joe Otter saw me yesterday on the Big River and told me of this place, and so, because I just had to go somewhere, I came here." Peter's eyes opened very wide with surprise. "Why?" he exclaimed. "I should think you would be perfectly safe on the Big River. I don't see how any harm can possibly come to you out there." The words were no sooner out of Peter's mouth than a faint bang sounded from way off towards the Big River. Mrs. Quack gave a great start and lifted her wings as if to fly, but she thought better of it, and then Peter saw that she was trembling all over. "Did you hear that?" she asked in a faint voice. Peter nodded. "That was a gun, a terrible gun, but it was a long way from here." "It was over on the big river," said Miss Quack. "That's why it isn't safe for me over there. That's why I just had to find some other place. Oh dear, the very sound of a gun sets me to shaking and makes my heart feel as if it would stop beating. Are you sure I am perfectly safe here?" "Perfectly," spoke up Jerry Muskrat, who had been listening from the top of the big rock. "Unless you are not smart enough to keep out of the clutches of Reddy Fox, or Old Man Coyote, or Hooty the Owl, or Redtail the Hawk." "I'm not afraid of them," declared Mrs. Quack. "It's those two-legged creatures with terrible guns I'm afraid of." And she began to swim about more uneasily than ever. Chapter 2. Mrs. Quack is distrustful. Jerry Muskrat thinks there is no place in the world like the Smiling Pool, so for the matter of that does Grandfather Frog and also Spotty the Turtle. You see, they have spent their lives there and know little about the rest of the great world. When Mrs. Quack explained that all she feared was that a two-legged creature with a terrible gun might find her there, Jerry Muskrat hastened to tell her that she had nothing to worry about on that account. "No one hunts here now that Farmer Brown's boy has put away his terrible gun," explained Jerry. "There was a time when he used to hunt here and set traps, which are worse than terrible guns. But that was long ago, before he knew any better." "Who is Farmer Brown's boy?" demanded Mrs. Quack, looking more anxious than ever. "Is he one of those two-legged creatures?" "Yes," said Peter Rabbit, who had been listening with all his ears. "But he is the best friend we Quaddies have. He is such a good friend that he ought to be a Quaddie himself. Why, this last winter he fed some of us when food was scarce, and he saved Miss Grouse when she was caught in a snare, which you know is a kind of trap. He won't let any harm come to you here, Mrs. Quack." "I wouldn't trust him, not for one single minute," said Mrs. Quack. "I wouldn't trust one of those two-legged creatures, not one. You say he fed some of you last winter, but that doesn't mean anything good. Do you know what I've known these two creatures to do?" "What?" demanded Peter and Jerry together. "I've known them to scatter food where we ducks would be sure to find it, and to take the greatest care that nothing should frighten us while we were eating. And then after we had got in the habit of feeding in that particular place and had grown to feel perfectly safe there, they had hidden close by until a lot of us were feeding together and then fired their terrible guns at us." "Oh, how dreadful!" cried Peter, looking quite as shocked as he felt. Then he added eagerly, "But our Farmer Brown's boy wouldn't do anything like that. You haven't the least thing to fear from him." "Perhaps not," said Mrs. Quack, shaking her head. "But I wouldn't trust him. I wouldn't trust him as far off as I could see him." "I wish I could believe he wouldn't harm us, but if you have been through what I've been through and suffered what I've suffered, you wouldn't trust one of those two-legged creatures. Why, for weeks they haven't given me a chance to get a square meal, and I don't know what has become of Mr. Quack, and I'm all alone." "Tell us all about it," begged Peter. "Perhaps we can help you." Chapter 3. Mrs. Quack tells about her home. "It's a long story," said Mrs. Quack, shaking the tears from her eyes, "and I hardly know where to begin." "Begin at the beginning," said Jerry Muskrat. "Your home is somewhere way up in the Northland where Honker the Goose lives, isn't it?" Mrs. Quack nodded. "I wish I were there this very minute, but sometimes I doubt if ever I'll get there again. You folks who don't have to leave your homes every year don't know how well off you are or how much you have to be thankful for. Remember, some animals or some birds go north in they fly south for the winter whenever it gets cold, and then they fly back home during the summer. Excuse me. I never could understand what people want to leave their homes for anyway, declared Peter. We don't leave because we want to, but because we have to, replied Mrs. Quack, and we go back just as soon as we can. What would you do if you couldn't find a single thing to eat? I guess I'd starve, replied Peter simply. I guess you would, and that is just what we would do if we didn't take the long journey south when Jack Frost freezes everything. He comes earlier up there and stays twice as long as he does down here. It makes 10 times as much ice and snow. We just have to come south. Then I don't see what you want to make your home in such a place for, says practical Peter. I should think you would make it where you can live all the year around. I was born there and I love it, just as you love the dear old briar patch. It is home, and there is no place like home. We have all we want of the food we love best. Everywhere is shallow water with tall grass growing in it. Huh, interrupted Peter. I wouldn't think much of a place like that. That's because you don't know what is good, snapped Jerry Muskrat. It would suit me, he added with shining eyes. There are the dearest little islands just made for safe nesting places, said Mrs. Quack. And the days are long and it's easy to hide, and there is nothing to fear for two-legged creatures with terrible guns never come. If there is nothing to fear, why do you care about places to hide? Well, of course we have enemies, just as you do here, but they are natural enemies. Foxes and minks and hawks and owls. And of course we watch out for them and have places where we can hide from them. But it is our wits against their wits, and it is our fault if we get caught. That is perfectly fair. They don't know what, it is only men who are not fair. They don't know what fairness is. Mrs. Quack went on, last summer, Mr. Quack and I had our nest on the dearest little island and no one found it. We had 12 eggs and then 12 of the dearest babies you ever saw. They grew so fast, and by the time the cold weather came, they were as big as their father and mother, and they were smart too. They had learned how to take care of themselves just as well as we could. And I certainly was proud of that family. But now I don't know where one of them is. Mrs. Quack suddenly choked up with grief. Chapter 4, Mrs. Quack continues her story. When Mrs. Quack told her 12 children how she didn't know where one of them was, Peter Rabbit and Jerry Muskrat knew just how badly she was feeling, and they turned their heads away and pretended they didn't see her tears. When Jack Frost came and we knew it was time to begin the long journey, Mr. Quack and myself and our 12 children joined with some other duck families, and with Mr. Quack in the lead, we started for our winter home, which really isn't a home, but just a place to stay. For a while, we had nothing much to fear. We could fly by day and at night rest in some quiet lake or pond. With the great woods all about us are sometimes great marshes. Perhaps you don't know what marshes are. If the green meadows here had little streams of water running every which way through them, and the ground was all soft and muddy and full of water, and the grass grew tall, they would be marshes. Jerry Muskrat's eyes sparkled. I would like a place like that, he exclaimed. You certainly would, replied Mrs. Quack. We always find lots of your relatives in such places. Marshes must be something like swamps, ventured Peter Rabbit, who had been thinking the matter over. Very much the same, only with grass and rushes in places of trees and bushes, replied Mrs. Quack. There's plenty to eat and the loveliest hiding places. In some of these we stayed days at a time. In fact, we stayed until Jack Frost came to drive us out. Then as we flew, we began to see the homes of these terrible two-legged creatures called men. If we could have just kept flying all the time or never had to go near the shore, we would have been all right, but we had to eat. Of course, said Peter, everybody has to eat. And we had to rest, Mrs. Quack. Certainly, said Peter, everybody has to do that. And to eat, we had to go in close to the shore where the water was not at all deep, because it is only in such places that we can get food. We would drop down a little nearer to water and a little nearer, but with all our watchfulness, we never could be sure, absolutely sure, that all was safe. Sometimes those terrible two-legged creatures would be hiding in the very middle of the wildest, most lonely-looking marshes. They would be covered with grass so that we couldn't see them. Then as we flew over them would come the bang, bang, bang of terrible guns, and always some of our flock would drop. We would have to leave them behind, for we knew if we wanted to live, we must get beyond the reach of those terrible guns. It was awful, simply awful. Mrs. Quack paused and shuddered. Peter Rabbit and Jerry Muskrat shuddered in sympathy. Sometimes we would have to try 3 or 4 feeding places before we found one where there was no terrible guns. Those who escaped the terrible guns would be so frightened that they would forget to follow the leader and fly in different directions, and later perhaps join other flocks. So it was that when at last we reached the place in sunny Southland for which we had started, Mr. Quack and I were alone. What became of our 12 children, I don't know. I am afraid the terrible guns killed some. I hope some joined other flocks and escaped, but I don't know. I hope they did too, said Peter. Chapter 5. Peter learns more of Mrs. Quack's troubles. It often happens when we know the troubles that our friends pass through, our own seem very small indeed. My, you must have felt glad when you reached your winter home, exclaimed Peter Rabbit, and Mrs. Quack finished the account of her long, terrible journey. I did, replied Mrs. Quack, but all the time I couldn't forget those to whom terrible things had happened on the way down, and I kept dreading the long journey back. I don't see why you didn't stay right there. I would have. Not if you were I, replied Mrs. Quack. In the first place, it isn't a proper place to which to bring up young ducks and make them strong and healthy. In the second place, there are more dangers down there for young ducks than up in the far Northland. In the third place, there isn't room for all the ducks to nest properly. And lastly, there is a great longing for our real home, which old Mother Nature has put in our hearts, and which makes us go. We couldn't be happy if we didn't. Is the journey back as bad as the journey down? Worse. Much worse. You can see for yourself just how bad it is, for here I am all alone. Tears filled Mrs. Quack's eyes. It is almost too terrible to talk about. You see, for one thing, food isn't as plentiful as it is in the fall, and we just have to go wherever it is to be found. Those two-legged creatures know where those feeding grounds are, and they hide with their guns just as they did when we were coming south. But it's much worse now. You see, when we were going the other way, we found them at one place, we could go to another. But when we were going north, we cannot always do that. Then there is nothing to do but to turn back to where those terrible guns are waiting for us. We just have to do it. Miss Quack stopped and shivered. It seems to me I have heard nothing but the noise of those guns ever since we started. Haven't had a good square meal for days and days, nor a good rest. That's what makes me so dreadfully nervous. Sometimes when we've been driven from place to place until we have caught up with Jack Frost, there would be nothing but ice. We would have to drop into one of these small places where the water runs too swiftly, because we had flown so far that our wings ached. Sometimes I think that those men with terrible guns must hate us and want to kill all of us. If they didn't, they would have a little bit of pity. They simply haven't any hearts at all. It does seem so, said Peter, but wait until you know Farmer Brown's boy. He's got a heart. I don't want to know him. If he comes near here, you'll see me leave in a hurry. I wouldn't trust one of them, not for a minute. So we're going to move ahead a little bit. Father Brown's boy actually comes and visits, and she is scared. But he leaves her some food to eat. And she flies away because she's scared. Chapter 7, Mrs. Quack returns. Peter Rabbit just couldn't go back to the dear old briar patch. He just had to know if Mrs. Quack would come back to the Smiling Pool. He had seen Farmer Brown's boy come there a second time and scatter wheat and corn among the brown stalks of last summer's rushes, and had guessed why Farmer Brown's boy had done this. He had guessed that he had put it there especially for Mrs. Quack, and if she should come back as she promised to do, he wanted to be on hand when she found those good things to eat and hear what she had to say. So Peter stayed over near the Smiling Pool and hoped with all his might that Reddy Fox, our old man coyote, would not take it into his head to come hunting over there. As luck would have it, neither of them did, and Peter had a very pleasant time gossiping with Jerry Muskrat. Jolly, round, red Mr. Sun was just getting ready to go to bed behind the purple hills when Mrs. Quack returned. The first Peter knew of her coming was the whistle of her wings as she passed over him. Several times she circled around high over the Smiling Pool, and Peter simply stared in open-mouthed admiration at the speed with which she flew. It didn't seem possible that one so big could move through the air so fast. Twice she set her wings and seemed to just slide down almost to the surface of the Smiling Pool, only to start her stout wings in motion once more. It was very clear that she was terribly nervous and suspicious. The third time she landed in the water with a splash and sat perfectly still with her head stretched up, looking and listening with all her might. I think she was listening for the two-legged hunters. "It's all right, there's nothing to fear," said Jerry Muskrat. "Are you sure?" asked Mrs. Quack. "I've been fooled too often by men." As she spoke, she swam about nervously. "Peter Rabbit and I have been here ever since you left, and I guess we ought to know. There hasn't been anybody near here except Farmer Brown's boy, and we told you he wouldn't hurt you." "He brought us each a carrot," Peter Rabbit broke in eagerly. "Just the same, I wouldn't trust him. Where is he now?" "He left ever so long ago, and he won't be back tonight," declared Peter. "I hope not," said Miss Quack with a sigh. "Did you hear the bang of that terrible gun just after I left?" "Yes," said Jerry Muskrat. "Was it fired at you?" Mrs. Quack nodded and held up one wing. Peter and Jerry could see that one of the long feathers was missing. I thought I was flying high enough to be safe, but when I reached the big river, there was a bang from the bushes on the bank and something cut that feather out of my wing. "Where have you been since you left us?" asked Peter. "Right in the middle of the big river. It was the only safe place. I didn't go near either shore and I nearly starved. I hadn't had a mouthful to eat all day." Peter opened his mouth to tell her the wheat and corn left by Farmer Brown's boy, but then closed it again. He was going to let her find it herself. He didn't think she'd trust it if he told her about it. So he kept still and waited. He was learning a great deal about Mrs. Quack. So Mrs. Quack actually finds it on her own and she eats it, and she starts to feel better, but she still mistrusts Farmer Brown's boy. So that is where we are going to end today. And we will take up the rest of the chapters at a later time. But I will tell you that Peter and all the other animals of the forest are going to try to help Mrs. Quack find her husband. So we will take up where we left off later. So thank you for listening to my story, and I will talk to you later and read to you later. Bye-bye.